The issue of illegal immigration and problems at the American border has been an issue that has been widely discussed and debated in the United States for quite some time now. During the Trump administration, it was typically cast as an issue of great moral urgency, illustrated by things like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez dressing up in a white outfit, a white costume, and driving down or flying down to the border and staring at a building through a fence while she was photographed in various forms and postures showing great distress and pain and internal suffering as she surveyed the plight and suffering of immigrants at the hands of the cruel fascist Trump administration. Now, very little has actually changed at the border since Joe Biden was inaugurated, except people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez no longer make those kind of melodramatic trips to the border. You never hear any longer about comparisons between how people are treated at the border and what the Nazis did to Jews throughout Europe. Those things are all gone. You barely hear any more about the treatment or mistreatment of migrants at the border now that Joe Biden is president. But what you do hear a lot of increasingly from Democratic Party mayors and governors who just a few years ago were denouncing anybody concerned with immigration or calling for greater restrictions as a white nationalist or a racist. And they would say things like the Statue of Liberty is crying, hearing people say that America should restrict the number of immigrants that we can have. Now they've completely changed their tune. And the reason, of course, is that large numbers of immigrants who are here illegally in the country are now being sent to and arriving in very large numbers, no longer just in border towns in Texas and Arizona or California, but instead in northern cities run by Democratic mayors and governors. And what they've been saying is almost verbatim what mayors and governors in border states and communities have been saying for many years now and being called racist for saying it, which is that the number of people entering the United States illegally, no matter how noble you think immigration is as a concept or how much you love diversity and believe it to strength, the sheer number is simply unmanageable for the country from almost every perspective, economically, logistically, culturally, in terms of us trying to assimilate those number of people. And now what Democratic mayors of Democratic cities, of blue cities, and being a mayor is really the kind of political office that requires you to be the most pragmatic. When people have problems in their everyday life, they blame the mayor. The mayor can't really afford to reside on a level of pure abstraction. You have mayors of New York and Washington and Chicago essentially demanding the Biden administration do more to prevent people from entering the border in the numbers that they are currently entering. It has become almost a political consensus that the federal government has failed in one of its core duties, which is to protect the American border. And that's true of people who have always believed in the nobility of immigration, the fact that America is a nation of immigrants, all of those bromides that are easy to say, but in the face of the sheer numbers, there are a lot of people, including in political office from both parties, now insisting that this has become unmanageable. Texas is, of course, one of the states that has been kind of at the forefront of all of this because they obviously are a border state. And measures that Texas has taken has caused a controversy between it and the federal government that just reached the Supreme Court. Now, before we get into that, here is the Voice of America from January of 2024, January 23rd, so last week, that says the following, quote, 9 U.S. governors called for action on immigration reform. The article says, quote, as the U.S. Congress struggles to agree on a package of immigration reform measures, the Democratic governors of 9 states have added their voices to the call for action. The letter demands the leaders make, quote, a serious commitment to improving a national immigration system that is, quote, outdated and unprepared to respond to a recent surge in migrants across the southern border. The list of governors calling for assistance includes the leaders of Arizona, California, and New Mexico, 3 states directly on the southern border. Their letter echoes the complaints of leaders in Republican-led Texas, which has a longer border with Mexico than the rest of the border states combined, and has been demanding increased federal assistance for years. However, several of the governors who signed the letter are from states far from the southern border, including Colorado, Illinois, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, and New York. Doesn't get more blue than that. Signaling that the stress of increased levels of immigration is being felt nationwide. Now, we actually covered the hypocrisy angle of this before that sickens me to my core because it's so emblematic of American liberalism, which is what they love to do is to go around imposing policies and constraints and restrictions and moral dictates on other people, knowing that they're allowed to insulate themselves from the effects of those policies, and therefore can call names and malign the people who actually have to confront the consequences of the policies that they, with great moral sanctimony, love to defend. And yet the minute those same liberals actually have to start confronting and living under the effects of those policies that they demand to be imposed on others, they will turn on a dime and start screaming bloody murder because liberals only like to support these kinds of policies and demand sacrifice from others as long as they and their families aren't part of the group that needs to in any way pay a price. And that's why you see this shift. But beyond the hypocrisy, it just simply demonstrates that no matter how kind-hearted somebody is, no matter how pro-immigrant somebody is, I mean, remember, a lot of these blue state governors and mayors, and obviously the Biden administration itself, have run for office and won by insisting that they will defend not just legal immigrants, but illegal immigrants as well, making themselves sanctuary cities. And they rely on a lot of immigration activists and groups of voters who are highly supportive of immigrants and very opposed to the idea of trying to close the border in any way. And yet it has become so unsustainable that those people are willing to betray their own constituencies and their own campaign promises to not just tolerate, but demand federal government action to close the border in a way that, as the article says, echoes the statements of longtime restriction advocates like Republican governors of Texas, who they have spent the last decade or so calling racist and white supremacists for expressing views that they themselves now advocate. Now, this issue between Texas and the U.S. government, namely the state of Texas concluded that the U.S. government was failing in its duties to protect Texas from the cost and impact of huge swarms of illegal immigrants, caused Texas to start to take matters into their own hands, including building things like barbed wire in areas such as near the Rio Grande to prevent crossings and entry into the state of Texas that everybody acknowledges has been effective, and yet the U.S. government under Biden took the position that Texas has no right to do that, that the only body authorized constitutionally to deal with the issue of immigration is the federal government, that states are powerless to do anything other than sit back and accept the failure of the federal government, even if it's harming their own budgets and their own citizens. And this case has made its way all the way to the Supreme Court, where last week, as The Guardian indicates, on January 22nd, U.S. Supreme Court allows Border Patrol to cut the razor wire installed by Texas. Quote, the justices grant an emergency appeal from the Biden administration in a 5-4 vote, while lawsuit over the wire on U.S.-Mexico border continues. Quote, the Concretino wire, another word for barbed wire, a type of barbed wire, deployed at the direction of the Republican Texas governor Greg Abbott, runs roughly 30 miles along the Rio Grande River near the border city of Eagle Pass. It is part of Abbott's broader fight with the Biden administration over immigration enforcement and what he calls Biden's reckless open borders policy. Border security and immigration officials fell under the purview of the federal government, as decided in the 2012 Supreme Court case Arizona versus United States. The court held that federal immigration law preempted Arizona's immigration laws. Now, that is true, but Texas has argued that their measures that they've taken are about a lot more than just keeping immigrants out of their state, including enhancing the safety of their state, the health of their state, protecting the budget of their state. And in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the level of the judiciary right immediately beneath the Supreme Court, the full Fifth Circuit reviewed all of the evidence that had been collected by the lower court that held the hearing. All of this was done through emergency measures because what was happening is the Biden administration dispatched Border Patrol agents and Homeland Security operatives to the state of Texas, where they began cutting down the barbed wire fence that Texas had constructed. And so Texas ran into a court seeking an emergency order blocking or enjoining the federal government from destroying its fence. And the Fifth Circuit issued that injunction. And then the federal government ran to the Supreme Court and asked for an emergency order vacating that injunction or giving them the green light, a go-ahead, to destroy that fence. And so what the Supreme Court did is usually when we have a Supreme Court ruling, especially on a controversial case like this, we have a long, detailed decision of both sides, often multiple judges from each side, laying out their rationale for why they cast their vote as they did. Because this was an emergency order, an emergency case, there was no real rationale given. There probably will be at some point in the future, either when this issue goes back to the Supreme Court or the Supreme Court just on its own explains this vote. But for now, all we have is a summary ruling that doesn't tell us anything other than who voted on which side. Here's the full content of the order where the Supreme Court decided against Texas. There you see Supreme Court, and it's titled Order in a Pending Case, Department of Homeland Security, Secretary et al., meaning other agencies, versus the state of Texas. And it says this: the application to vacate injunction presented to Justice Alito and by him referred to the court is granted. So this is the court's only substantive ruling. There was an injunction issued by the Fifth Circuit ordering the federal government to stop taking down Texas's fence. There was an application made by the U.S. government to vacate that injunction. Purely as technicality, in the first instance, it gets sent to a specific justice of the Supreme Court in an emergency action, and then that judge has the discretion either to decide on his own, or if it's a case of greater importance, to refer it to the full court. It got assigned to Justice Alito. He referred it to the full court. And here the court is granting the government's application to vacate the injunction. The December 19, 2023 order of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit is vacated. So that's the ruling by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in Texas's favor, and it's hereby vacated. So they overturned that ruling, and they vacated the injunction, giving the green light to the federal government to go destroy Texas's fence. The judges who would have voted to deny the application, who would have ruled in favor of Texas, were Justices Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. Right now, the conservatives on the court have a 6-3 majority, so it's not enough to have just one conservative judge rule with the liberal justices. You have to have two. And in this case, the liberal justices, the three liberal justices, were joined by both John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett. And that's how you got the 5-4 ruling. In this case, if you're wondering why would Amy Coney Barrett, maybe you're not wondering about John Roberts, he does more often than any of the other conservative judges, join the liberal judges. But if you're wondering why Amy Coney Barrett would do so, it's because it doesn't really have anything to do with the question of immigration. The ruling is really about the constitutional role assigned to the federal government versus the states on the question of immigration policy. And it is the case, as the Guardian alluded to and as we're about to show you, that the Supreme Court has previously ruled on several occasions, most explicitly in 2012, that immigration policy can radically affect the relationship that the United States has with other countries, because these migrants are coming from other countries. The measures that we take to keep migrants out or letting them in have an effect on our relationship with other countries, countries that border the United States, but ones that are in its proximity. And as a result of the clear intention of the Constitution to place issues of foreign policy, largely though not entirely, in the hands of the executive branch, but entirely in the hands of the federal government, the idea has always been that states cannot override the federal government on issues of immigration because it's really a question of foreign policy. And then there's a subsidiary issue of something called the Supremacy Clause that basically means that in any area where the federal government has decided to legislate, and obviously immigration is an area where they decided to legislate, anytime there's a conflict between the state and the federal government, in any such instance, the federal government is supreme. The federal government can override the state, in part because you don't want to have, especially when it comes to foreign policy, different states doing different things, so there's no clarity in foreign policy. Now, we don't have a rationale from the Supreme Court, so I can't tell you that that's why Amy Coney Barrett decided in favor of the U.S. government and against Texas. My belief, my strong belief, however, is that that is her argument, and it's one that, A, is stripped of any kind of ideological or political view, given, again, that that would not be a question of how one views immigration, but also, B, I have to say that even if I disagree with Amy Coney Barrett, and for reasons I'm about to tell you, I do in this case, you do actually want to encourage Supreme Court justices to be willing to vote on the principles of constitutional law and the issues of statutory authority, regardless of their political agenda. In fact, one of the worst things that has happened is that most Supreme Court rulings are now predictable and break down along the lines of Democrat or Republican, or conservative versus liberal. And while you expect that in certain instances, everybody knows that conservative judges interpret the Constitution differently than liberal judges on questions like gun control or abortion. There are a lot of issues where you hope that there is no ideological component to it, where judges are able to separate their political agenda. There's no question Amy Coney Barrett is a political conservative, to separate their political agenda from their jurisprudential rulings. Even if their willingness to do that in a certain case ends up angering you or undermining your political agenda, that's something we should applaud judges when they do so. And it rarely happens. And so if that's what Amy Coney Barrett did here, then even though she might have caused a political outcome that a lot of conservatives dislike, the act itself, if in fact that's what she did, and it's hard to know for sure, though I speculate, is something that I think ought to be considered noble. Now, let's look at the Fifth Circuit ruling, because the Fifth Circuit ruling, which ruled in favor of Texas, actually issued the kind of judicial decision that enables us to see what the issues are in this case, what the factual findings are of the lower court judge, and how much in favor of Texas both the lower court judge and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals found, and why on the constitutional issues, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is known as a more conservative court, decided even on the legal issues that Texas has the authority to act here, even though in general immigration as a foreign policy matter is left to the federal government. So let's start off with, we selected the passages we think are most important to enable us to understand the issues here. So here's how the ruling begins, or toward the beginning of the ruling. Quote, although the 1,200 miles of the Rio Grande forming the border between Texas and Mexico, there are 29 official points of entry into the United States. To guard the, quote, vast stretches of land between these points, Congress created the Border Patrol, whose objective is to, quote, deter illegal entry in the United States. In recent years, illegal crossings have increased dramatically. Quote, the number of Border Patrol encounters with migrants illegally entering the country has swelled from a comparatively paltry 458,000 in 2020 to 1.7 million in 2021 and 2.4 million in 2022. So that's a five-fold increase just from 2020 to 2022. Here's that five-fold increase. That's an extraordinary amount in essentially 3 years. A comparatively paltry 458,000 cases where Border Patrol agents encountered migrants illegally entering to 2.4 million in 2022. Obviously, they are coming in much, much greater numbers than they did back in 2020 when Donald Trump was president. There's just no question about that. And it didn't just increase by a small amount, it increased exponentially. The court goes on, quote, unsurprisingly, the situation has been exploited by drug cartels who have made, quote, an incredibly lucrative expertise out of trafficking human beings and illegal drugs like fentanyl, which, quote, is frequently encountered in vast quantities at the border. In 2021, Texas launched Operation Lone Star to aid the Border Patrol through allocation of state resources. The activity in question here is Texas's, quote, laying of concertina wire along several sections of the riverfront. The wire serves as, quote, deterrent, an effective one at that, causing illegal crossings to drop precipitously. Quote, by all accounts, Border Patrol is grateful for the assistance of Texas law enforcement, and the evidence shows the parties work cooperatively across the state, including in El Paso and the Rio Grande Valley. Now, let me stop here and say that I know that immigration is an issue that provokes a lot of deeply polarizing feelings, and I'm sure there are people in this audience who, like a lot of issues we cover, Russia and Ukraine, the war in Israel, the U.S. role in that war, the Middle East, and definitely this ruling, probably think very differently about this issue. And so what I want to emphasize is that what the court just did, what I just read from, were the factual findings by the lower court that held an evidentiary hearing. And remember that lower court sort of did what I just speculated Amy Coney Barrett did. The lower court sided with Texas on almost every question. And all of the things I just read to you about the efficacy of the border fence, about the massive increased exponential problem of illegal immigration Texas was facing, were all factual findings by the court. And yet the court nonetheless dismissed Texas's lawsuit on the grounds that the United States enjoys sovereign immunity. So there was a court clearly favoring and deciding in favor of Texas on the substantive question, and yet still able to issue a legal ruling that prevented Texas from prevailing. So I just want to have everyone do our best to try and be able to understand the factual issues, the factual evidence, and the legal issues without letting all of that be clouded by the political controversy that undergirds all of it, because it's fundamental to understanding what the courts are trying to do here. So the court goes on, quote, although the court would ultimately deny a preliminary injunction on sovereign immunity grounds, that's the lower court they're talking about, the court made numerous fact findings supporting Texas's trespass to chattel claims. As a general matter, the court rejected the defendant's claim, that's the government's, that the Border Patrol was justified in cutting the barbed wire. This is the government's argument as to why they were justified in cutting Texas's barbed wire. And the court rejected all these arguments, but this was the government's argument. One, to inspect, apprehend, and detain illegal aliens. And two, to prevent or address medical emergencies. To the contrary, the court found that the Border Patrol cut the wire, quote, for no apparent purpose other than to allow migrants easier entrance further inland. So here's a case where the government was trying to say, look, we're not trying to sabotage Texas's efforts to keep out migrants. Oh no, to the contrary, we want to cut down the fence because that's what enables us to be able to get into the Rio Grande and keep them out. And the court said that that was a lie based on all the evidence, based on all the testimony about what the Border Patrol is actually doing when they cut down the fence. They're not actually cutting down the fence and then using their access to that land to keep the migrants out. They're cutting down the fence in order to facilitate the entrance of these migrants into Texas and into the United States. As for this claim that, oh, we can't have a fence because it prevents us from getting in to that area that the fence keeps out and saving people who are suffering from medical emergencies, Texas has always said that they agree the United States government, the Border Patrol, have the absolute right to access that area in the event of medical emergencies, and nobody ever claimed that Texas tried to impede the Border Patrol in any way from doing so. So the government had two reasons, two justifications for why it wants to cut down Texas's Border Patrol, Texas's fence, and basically it was a preposterous farce. Namely that, oh, we're trying to do it because it'll help us keep migrants out. And the court said everything in the record demonstrates the federal government is lying there. They're not trying to keep out these migrants, they're trying to let them in. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.